Imagine losing everything that matters most in your life, sinking into a loneliness so deep that there seems to be no way out. This is the story of Michael Harris, a man who gave up on life after his wife's death and completely isolated himself from the world. But when he is struck by a serious illness, and the only person who stands by his side is someone he barely notices, Michael is forced to confront his deepest pain. This is a journey about how love and patience can save someone on the brink of despair. Don't miss this emotional story of redemption, struggle, and overcoming. If you want more stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Michael Harris stared at his reflection in the mirror with a vacant expression. The 35-year-old man looking back at him was unrecognizable. The smile he once had was gone, and the eyes that once sparkled with hope were now dull and lifeless. The death of Sarah, his wife, had turned his life into a sea of pain and loneliness, in which he chose to lose himself. From the day they buried her, he threw himself into work, avoiding any kind of emotional involvement. It was easier, safer. He had built a wall around himself, an impenetrable barrier that kept anyone from getting close. Friends, family, and even colleagues no longer dared to try breaking through the cold shell that Michael had created. His only social interaction, if it could even be called that, was with the office staff, whom he barely looked in the eye, and of course with Emily. Emily had been his housekeeper for 5 years, a quiet woman in her 50s, who had always taken care of Michael's house with an almost maternal dedication. When Sarah died, Emily continued with her work, although she knew that the man she had once known was no longer the same. The sparkle in Michael's eyes had vanished, and his coldness was palpable. Nevertheless, she stayed, enduring his harsh words and indifference. Michael's house, once full of life and warmth, now reflected his soul. The rooms that used to be bright and welcoming were always dark, with the curtains drawn, the furniture covered in dust, and the plants wilting. He no longer cared to take care of anything. He lived for work, and work was all he did. The dining table, which had once hosted lively dinners with Sarah, was now covered with papers and documents. Michael spent entire days without even remembering to eat, immersed in reports and projects, as if he were determined to forget the world outside. Emily silently observed this decline. She always knew that Michael was a broken man, but she never said a word. She knew he needed time, even though it was clear that he wasn't truly trying to heal. It's like watching someone drown, knowing they don't want help, she thought to herself as she cleaned the remnants of a breakfast Michael hadn't even touched. At times, she tried to start a conversation. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Michael never looked at her. "I'm busy," he would reply curtly, without taking his eyes off the computer. Emily, with her unwavering patience, would simply nod and continue her work. She knew that he needed something more than what she could offer with words. Maybe with time, he would realize what he was missing. But time went by, and Michael kept sinking, growing more distant, growing colder. His health began to reflect the state of his soul. The work, which had once been his refuge, started to become a burden. He spent long hours in the office, but his productivity dwindled. The weight of exhaustion was always on his shoulders, and his appearance began to deteriorate. Sleepless nights left him with deep dark circles and constant fatigue. His body, which had always been healthy, began to give in under the stress and neglect. Emily saw it all, not knowing what to do. She watched him slowly wither away, and even though she wanted to help, she knew that Michael would not accept any interference. It was as if he had decided to give up, to slowly disappear, like a shadow dissolving at the end of the day. One day, while cleaning the living room, Emily noticed that Michael was taking longer than usual to come down for breakfast. She knocked on his bedroom door, but there was no answer. Her heart racing, she slowly opened the door and found him lying in bed, pale and sweating profusely. He was clearly too weak to get up. For the first time in a long while, Michael's face didn't show coldness or indifference, but vulnerability. "Mr. Harris?" Emily whispered, worried. Michael tried to move but seemed incapable. I think I need help, he murmured, his voice so weak it seemed to belong to someone else. It was at that moment that everything began to change. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. The night had been long and restless for Michael. His fever had worsened, and his body felt heavier with each passing hour. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and the exhaustion consumed him in a way he had never experienced before. When he opened his eyes in the morning, he realized he couldn't even get out of bed. Everything seemed distant and confused, as if his mind was wrapped in a thick fog. For years, Michael had been the pillar of his own life. He had never needed anyone and took pride in that. Sarah's death had only reinforced that belief. He convinced himself that the only possible path was solitude and work. And now, for the first time, he found himself completely dependent. This reality hit him hard, bringing a bitter sense of humiliation. Emily entered Michael's room with a cautious silence. The air was heavy, and the paleness in his face made her shudder. Without saying a word, she approached and touched Michael's forehead, confirming what she already knew. "You have a high fever, Mr. Harris," she said in a calm but concerned tone. Michael tried to pull away, almost in disdain. "I'm fine, I just need rest." But they both knew that wasn't true. His condition was worsening quickly, and Emily, despite being only his housekeeper, understood the gravity of the situation. Michael, however, hated the idea of being weak, of needing someone to take care of him. He had always been the one in control of everything. And now, he couldn't even control his own body. "You need a doctor," Emily said, gently insisting. Michael turned over in bed, facing away from her as a gesture of refusal. "I told you I'm fine," he replied irritably. Emily sighed, realizing that any attempt to convince him would be in vain. She knew Michael wouldn't allow a doctor into his home, nor would he accept external help. So, she decided to take care of him on her own. In the days that followed, Emily dedicated herself to looking after Michael, even when he resisted every attempt to help. She prepared light meals that he refused to eat. She brought cool towels to try to reduce his fever, and he pushed her hand away. Michael was trapped in an internal battle, a fight between the need for help and the pride of refusing it. The idea of depending on someone made him feel small, powerless. Michael's weakness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He hated feeling like he was losing control. The illness imprisoned him in a reality he never wanted to accept. He wasn't invincible. Every gesture from Emily seemed to reinforce that feeling, and it infuriated him deeply. "I don't need you, Emily," he shouted in a fit of frustration, his voice hoarse and tired. Emily's expression didn't change. It remained soft, almost understanding. "I know you don't, Mr. Harris, but I'm here anyway." Michael turned his face away, humiliated by his own condition. His voice faltered as he tried to form another response, but nothing came out. In silence, he realized that he was completely at her mercy. There was no one else in his life who could care, no one he had allowed in, except for Emily. That realization weighed on his shoulders like an unbearable burden. Days passed, and the fever didn't subside. Emily remained steadfast in her mission, caring for him with a patience Michael didn't deserve. At night, he would hear her walking around the house, checking that everything was in order, preparing medicine, and organizing the few items that still held some emotional value for him. It was as if she were trying to save some part of his life that he had let die along with Sarah. Michael hated to admit it, but Emily's presence was starting to change something inside him. There was something comforting about having her around, even though he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. One night, while lying in bed, he wondered why she still cared. "Why is she still here?" he thought, staring at the ceiling. He had treated her with indifference for so long, pushing her away, just as he had done with everyone else. Yet, there she was, caring for him without expecting anything in return. It was in a moment of vulnerability that Michael opened up for the first time in years. He woke up in the middle of the night, his body covered in sweat and his mind foggy. Emily was sitting in a chair next to the bed, holding a book that seemed to have been on the shelf for years, covered in dust. "You don't have to stay here, Emily," he said, his voice low and tired. She looked up from the book, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. "I know I don't have to, but I want to." Those words echoed in Michael's mind in a way he couldn't understand. Why did she want to be there? What was it about him that made her care so much? For the first time, he allowed himself to question his own choices. Maybe, deep down, he had pushed people away because he couldn't bear the thought of being vulnerable again. Maybe he was afraid of being hurt again, of losing someone he loved. But at that moment, all he felt was loneliness. The following days felt endless for Michael. His fever fluctuated, sometimes improving, but soon returning with full force. Each attempt to get out of bed was a failure. Every step turned into a battle against his own body, which seemed to be giving up on him. And with each failure, the anger inside him grew. It wasn't just anger at the illness, but at himself, at his inability to control his own life. Emily remained by his side, silent and diligent. But to Michael, her presence was a constant reminder of his weakness. He hated it. He hated seeing the patience in her eyes that he never had for himself. He hated depending on her for the most basic things, food, medicine, even just to get out of bed. Every time she helped him, his shame turned into frustration. "I'm not an invalid," he shouted one morning, noticing Emily preparing another tray of breakfast that he refused to touch. "I can't take care of myself." Emily, with her characteristic calm, didn't respond right away. She knew that any reply at that moment would only fuel Michael's anger. But he didn't stop there. "I don't need you, understand? I don't need your pity, your charity. Go away, Emily. I'm fine on my own." She stood still for a moment, observing Michael's contorted face, a mix of pain and fury. She knew those words didn't come from a place of truth, but from a desperate, fearful man. She had seen this before. Many times, people lash out when they're most vulnerable. Still, hearing those words hurt. "I'll prepare your medicine," she said calmly, unaffected by his words. Michael turned his face away, irritated by her refusal to fight back. In his mind, he justified his cruelty as a necessary defense. If he didn't push her away, he would end up relying on her even more, and that was something he couldn't allow. The reality, however, was that Michael was already completely dependent on Emily. Without her, he wouldn't have food. He wouldn't have the medicine that kept his fever under control. But admitting this was admitting defeat, and Michael wasn't ready for that. His pride, his desperate need to control everything, prevented him from accepting the truth. The isolation he lived in only contributed to this spiral of frustration. There was no one else. The friends who had once been part of his life had disappeared over time, tired of his excuses, of his emotional absence. Work, which had once been his only refuge, now became a heavy burden. He had been absent from the office for weeks, and although he had tried to remotely manage company operations, his failing health prevented him from doing anything effectively. His phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was for bills or problems he didn't have the energy to solve. The cruel truth was that Michael found himself completely alone, except for Emily. And that terrified him. The weight of this reality became increasingly unbearable. Michael began losing more than just his health. He was losing his connection to the world. The nights became too long, the days repetitive and purposeless. He couldn't even remember the last time he had felt something beyond physical and emotional pain. One day, during a failed attempt to get up, Michael collapsed to the floor, hitting his head on the edge of the bed. The pain made him cry out, and within seconds Emily was at his side, trying to help him up. But to her surprise, he pushed her away. "Leave me," he shouted, his voice full of hatred. Emily stepped back, startled by the intensity of his outburst. "I don't need your help," he continued, now almost in tears. "I don't need anyone. Just go away." Emily stood there looking at him, unsure of what to say. The sight of Michael lying on the floor, his fragile and battered figure, filled her with sadness. She knew he was drowning in his own pain, but she also knew she couldn't force him to accept help. He needed to choose. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm here to help, whether you want it or not." Michael went silent, too exhausted to respond. All he wanted was for it to end, for the pain to stop, for the world to just leave him alone. But the world didn't work like that. There was no escaping reality, and he knew it. Over time, Michael began to realize that his resistance made no sense. Emily wasn't leaving. No matter how many times he yelled at her or insulted her, she remained there, with the same unshakable patience as always. It was as if she saw something in him that he couldn't see in himself. And that deeply bothered him. Little by little he began to give in, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer had the strength to fight. The pride that had kept him isolated from everyone now felt like a prison. With each passing day, Michael found himself more dependent on Emily. And ironically, that dependence began to force a change within him. He couldn't explain what was happening, but for the first time in years, he felt something beyond bitterness and anger. But it was still too early to understand what that meant. The pain, both physical and emotional, was still there, constant, relentless. What Michael didn't know was that this moment of surrender would be the first step toward his transformation. And as much as he hated to admit it, he needed someone. He needed Emily. The days turned into weeks, and Michael's weakness continued to consume him. Although the fever had subsided slightly, he still felt trapped in a prison of his own existence. Every movement seemed like a struggle, and every thought took him back to the emptiness he had felt since losing Sarah. But unlike the previous weeks, something was beginning to change inside him, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he couldn't continue living this way. Michael was lying in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, when thoughts began to invade his mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about Sarah, not as a painful memory, but as someone who had once brought joy into his life. The pain was still there, deep and suffocating, but now there was something more. He wondered what his life would have been like if he had taken a different path, if he hadn't pushed everyone away, if he had allowed someone to get close. Maybe he wouldn't be so lonely now, lying in bed, needing help to survive. But what really bothered him was why Emily was still there. She had no obligation to care for him. She wasn't a relative, not even a close friend. He had always treated her with coldness, never offering more than a mechanical good morning. And yet, there she was day after day, taking care of him with the same dedication she'd always had, maybe even more now that he was ill. Why? Michael glanced at the door, where Emily would enter every morning with a breakfast tray he rarely touched. Her image began to take on new dimensions in his mind. He had never really paid attention to who Emily was. To him, she was just a constant presence, an efficient employee. But now he found himself wondering about her life, about her motivations. What kept her by his side? That morning, Emily entered as usual, with a tray in hand, without saying a word. She placed a tray on the bedside table and adjusted Michael's pillows, as she always did. He watched her in silence, something inside him urging him to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was only when Emily turned to leave that he unexpectedly broke the silence. "Why do you do this?" His voice was hoarse and weak, but filled with a genuine curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily stopped, surprised by the question. She turned to him, her eyes soft but questioning. "Do what, Mr. Harris?" "Take care of me," Michael replied, forcing himself to continue. "You don't have to do this. I've never treated you well." Emily took a deep breath, her eyes studying Michael's tired face. She knew this moment would come eventually, A moment when he would allow himself to ask something deeper, something that would force him to confront his own pain. "I take care of you because someone has to," she answered simply. Michael frowned, dissatisfied with the simplicity of her answer. "That doesn't make sense," he murmured, frustration growing in his voice. "No one does this just because they feel they should. I know how people work. They leave when you push them away. They give up when you don't care." Emily gave a small smile, a smile full of patience and understanding. "Not everyone is like that, Mr. Harris. Some people see beyond what's shown. Some people know that behind all the coldness and bitterness, there's someone who needs help, even if they don't admit it." Those words hit Michael like a slap. He looked away, feeling exposed, vulnerable. Emily could see through him in a way no one else could, not even he himself. "You don't know anything about me," he responded defensively. "Maybe I don't know everything," Emily said, taking a step forward. "But I know enough. I know you lost someone you loved, and that it broke you. I know you think you don't deserve help or love or anything good. But that doesn't mean you're right." Michael remained silent. Emily's words echoed in his mind, resonating in a place he had tried to ignore for so long. She was right. He had convinced himself that he didn't deserve anything good in life since Sarah was gone. He believed that the world and the people in it could no longer offer him comfort. And so, he had shut himself off, creating a world where pain and isolation were his only companions. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to question that. And that scared him. As Michael processed what Emily had said, he also began to reflect on her. Emily had always been a background figure in his life, someone he barely noticed. But now he wondered who she really was. What was her life like outside of this house? What kept her going? There was a strength in Emily that he had never realized, a resilience that he envied. She seemed immune to his coldness, to his indifference. But why? Emily watched him as he wrestled with his thoughts. She knew Michael was fighting an internal battle, one he had avoided for years. She didn't intend to force anything. She knew he needed time, and she was willing to give him that time. After all, she also knew what loss was like. She knew what it was like to live in a constant state of pain. Although Michael didn't know it, Emily carried scars too. Years ago, she had lost her husband in an accident, and for a long time, she refused to accept help from anyone. She threw herself into work just like Michael, and for a long time, believed she was fine. But time had taught her that no one can live alone forever, that everyone needs someone, even the strongest person in the world. Perhaps that's why Emily understood so well what Michael was going through. Perhaps that's why she didn't give up, because she had been there, in that dark place, and knew how hard it was to get out. And now, she saw the same pain in Michael's eyes, the same resistance she had once had. "You don't have to go through this alone, Mr. Harris," she said softly before turning and leaving the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Michael remained silent, staring at the door where Emily had just left. For the first time, he felt that he wasn't truly alone. And for the first time in a long time, that made him feel something he thought he had forgotten: hope. Michael was sitting on the edge of the bed, his feet touching the cold floor for the first time in weeks. His body was still weak, but there was a small flicker of strength emerging within him, a strength he hadn't felt in a long time. In the past few days, he had begun to accept Emily's help, not with gratitude, but with quiet resignation. He knew he couldn't keep fighting her or his own reality. For the first time, there was a sense of relief, a small spark of hope. He still felt distant, as if his life were separated by an invisible barrier. But that barrier seemed, little by little, to begin dissolving. Emily had become more than just a presence. She was an anchor. When he looked at her, he no longer saw just a housekeeper. He saw someone who was there by choice, someone who, for reasons he couldn't understand, cared about him. That realization was starting to change something inside Michael. One afternoon, after a long period of silence between them, Michael broke the monotony. "Emily," he began, his voice still weak, "I never asked about your life." "About you?" The sentence was simple, but loaded with emotional weight for both of them. For Michael, it was a big step. He was opening a door he had kept locked for so long. Emily paused for a moment, surprised by the question. She had never expected Michael to show any interest in her personal life. She knew he was used to being closed off, keeping his distance from anything that wasn't related to work or the pain he carried. "There's not much to tell," she replied with a faint smile, continuing to adjust Michael's pillow. "That can't be true," Michael insisted, his eyes locking onto hers. You've always been here, taking care of me, even when I didn't deserve it. I never understood why. And now, I want to know." Emily sat down in a chair near the bed, watching him with the look of someone pondering where to begin. "I've told you before, Mr. Harris, that everyone needs help sometimes. And maybe more than just caring for your house. I stayed because I knew what it's like to feel pain." Michael stared at her, his eyes searching for more. For the first time, he wanted to understand who this woman was, the one who had endured his worst moments without asking for anything in return. "How could you understand?" he asked, not with coldness this time, but with genuine curiosity. Emily took a deep breath, as if that moment was difficult for her too. "I lost someone many years ago," she began, looking at the floor for a brief moment before continuing. "My husband, he died in a car accident when we had only been married for 5 years. It was devastating." Michael remained silent, absorbing that information. He had never known this. The pain on Emily's face was evident, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of his own pain in her. "And how did you deal with it?" he asked, hesitant, as if afraid of the answer. "I didn't," Emily replied, with a bitter laugh. "At least not at first. I pushed everyone away, buried myself in work, just like you did. I thought if I kept my hands busy, my mind wouldn't have time to think about the pain." She paused, her eyes fixed on the window. "But you can't run from pain forever. It catches up to you one way or another." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He knew exactly what she meant. For so long, he believed he was in control, that by isolating himself and focusing on work, he could bury the pain. But the truth was that the pain had never really left. It had been there all along, slowly eating away at him. "And now," he asked softly, "have you moved past it?" Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with deep understanding. "I don't think we ever moved past it, Mr. Harris. We just learned to live with it. The pain becomes part of who we are, but it doesn't have to define us forever." Those words echoed in Michael's mind. For the first time, he felt that there might be a way out of the black hole he had been in. Maybe just like Emily, he could learn to live with the pain without letting it completely destroy him. He began to feel grateful for Emily, for her patience, for her insistence on staying, even when he didn't deserve it. In the days that followed, Michael made a conscious effort to connect more with Emily, to talk, to try to learn more about her, and in a way about himself. He began to feel a small breath of hope. Things were still hard, the pain was still there, but now there seemed to be a light at the end of the tunnel, something he couldn't see before. But like a shadow creeping behind a sunny day, the illusion of improvement was soon crushed by a new reality. On a cold morning, while trying to get out of bed, Michael collapsed onto the floor again, this time with an excruciating pain in his chest. It was a different kind of pain, intense and crushing. He gasped for breath, his body trembling, as the sensation of panic overtook him. Emily rushed to his side, but this time, the situation was far more serious. "Michael," she cried, holding his face as he struggled to breathe. "I'm calling an ambulance." He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the world around him was collapsing, and all the small hopes he had started to build were falling apart. Fear and pain intertwined, and Michael realized that, despite everything, he was still on the edge of the abyss. Emily called for emergency services, her voice trembling as she described the situation. Michael, on the floor, felt despair seeping into every part of his body. He thought he was starting to get better, but now it felt like maybe there wouldn't be a true recovery. Maybe this was the end. Everything he had started to imagine, a different life, a reconnection with humanity, seemed to be crumbling before him. And for the first time, he was afraid to die. The constant sound of the heart monitors filled the room, and Michael, lying in the hospital bed, could hardly believe he was there. Everything seemed like a blur since the moment the ambulance took him from his home, with Emily by his side, holding his hand as he struggled against the crushing pain in his chest. The doctors had said it was a mild heart attack, but enough to put him under observation. He was alive, but the persistent fear that something worse might happen kept him awake, anxiety gnawing at his insides. Michael had always believed he was in control of his life, but now, that idea seemed like a cruel joke. He couldn't control his body, couldn't control the illness that had brought him down, and worse still, he couldn't control the fact that he was completely alone except for Emily. In that moment, loneliness was as tangible as the physical pain. He had never allowed himself to trust anyone, and now he had no one else to turn to. Emily remained by the bed, tireless in her vigil. She had helped him settle into the hospital, spoken to the doctors, and even though she knew Michael had pushed her away so many times, she stayed. Michael, on the other hand, was silent, but inside, a storm of thoughts consumed him. He thought of Sarah, of how things would be if she were still alive. He thought about how his life had fallen apart since losing her. He thought about all the people he had pushed away out of fear of being hurt again. And now, he was paying the price. "I'm here, Michael," Emily said in a soft whisper, as she adjusted the blanket over him. "You don't have to face this alone." Michael turned his face to the side, unable to look at her. Pride still held him back, but now it was mixed with something new: regret. He knew he had wasted so much time he could have spent building new relationships, reconnecting with the world. Now lying in a hospital, feeling the fragility of his own existence, all he could think about was how he had failed to truly live. Michael began to speak, but his voice failed. He closed his eyes, trying to find the words. "I don't know why you're still here," Emily sighed, sitting down beside the bed. She looked at Michael's face. The features that had once been strong and determined now softened by pain and fragility. "I've told you before, Michael, some people don't give up so easily. And I see something in you that maybe you can't see yet." "I'm not that person," he murmured, his voice filled with sadness. "Maybe I was once, but now I'm just this." He gestured weakly to himself, pointing to the body that had betrayed him, to the hospital bed that symbolized his helplessness. "I've lost everything." Emily shook her head, her eyes full of calm understanding. "You think you've lost everything because you can't see beyond what's in front of you. Yes, you're sick. Yes, you've pushed people away. But none of this is irreversible, Michael. Life goes on, and you can still change." Those words pierced Michael's heart like a thin blade. He wanted to believe them, wanted to hold on to the idea that he could rebuild his life, but the reality felt too overwhelming. He was in a hospital, weak and vulnerable, with no guarantee that things would really get better. And beyond the physical pain, there was the emotional pain of knowing that he had dug this hole he now found himself in. The days in the hospital passed slowly, each one seeming more difficult than the last. The doctors came and went, talking about treatments, recovery, and future care. But what really troubled Michael was the silence that settled in his mind when he was left alone, especially at night when Emily left to rest. In those moments, he was forced to confront the emptiness his life had become. One night, after Emily had gone, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He felt as if he were drifting in a dark sea, aimless. The only thing that anchored him in some way was Emily's presence. Without her, he didn't know if he would have the strength to keep going. But that deeply troubled him. He hated depending on someone else, especially now that his weakness was exposed for everyone to see. Amid these thoughts, Michael began to remember his childhood, how his parents had always taught him that independence was the most important thing. They had raised him to be strong, to never depend on anyone, to be the captain of his own destiny. But now, looking at the situation he was in, he wondered if that worldview was really what he needed. Maybe life was more about sharing the burdens than carrying them alone. The next morning, when Emily arrived, Michael looked at her with a different expression. There was something new in his eyes, a mix of fear and acceptance. "Emily," he began hesitantly, "I don't know if I can do this." Emily frowned, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "Do what, Michael?" "Live like this," he replied, his voice broken. "I'm tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being alone. I don't know how to keep going." She watched him in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. She knew he was reaching his limit, that the pain and loneliness were consuming him from the inside out. But she also knew that sometimes people had to hit rock bottom before they could start climbing back up. "You're not alone anymore, Michael," she said softly. "And as for the fight, well, we all fight. But now you have someone to fight beside you." Her words touched something deep within Michael, but at the same time, he felt he still wasn't ready to fully believe them. The idea of allowing himself to trust someone else, to let go of his pride and accept that he needed help, was too terrifying. And so, Michael found himself trapped between two realities: the reality of his pain and the possibility of healing, unsure of which way his life would turn. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, but Michael barely noticed. The air around him felt heavy, as if the weight of his own existence was slowly crushing him. He could feel the coldness of the sheet against his skin, but it brought no comfort. The sound of the heart monitor beside the bed, with its steady rhythm, was an annoying reminder that he was still alive, trapped in a body that felt like it was failing him, and in a mind that wouldn't stop torturing him. Emily sat in the chair beside him, a book open in her lap, but her eyes weren't on the page. She was watching Michael, trying to decipher the thoughts consuming him, but he kept his face turned away, distant. It was as if the man she knew was drowning, and even though she was so close, she couldn't reach him. "Michael," Emily finally broke the silence, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "What are you thinking?" He took a moment to respond, the sound of deep breathing filling the space between them. "That it's all pointless," he murmured, not even turning to look at her. "I'm here, stuck in this bed, stuck in this life, and none of it makes any sense." Emily frowned, her chest tightening at the pain in his words. "Don't say that. You're alive, and that's already a victory. We can't just give up." Michael finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark and tired, as if every word required monumental effort. "Alive? For what, Emily? To lie here in this hospital, depending on you for everything? To be reminded every day that I'm weak, incapable of living on my own." She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm in the face of Michael's overwhelming frustration. She knew he was broken inside, and every word was a desperate attempt to hold onto something that kept him standing. "You don't need to live alone, Michael," she responded, her voice firm but tender. "No one does. It's not weakness to accept that you need help. Everyone needs someone, and that doesn't make you any less." "I've always been alone," he shot back, his voice rising slightly, his eyes glistening with accumulated anger and pain. "I don't need anyone. I never have. And now I'm at the mercy of everyone. This is all that's left of my life." Emily leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "That's what you believe, but it's not the truth. You've convinced yourself of that because you're afraid, Michael. Afraid of getting hurt again. Afraid of losing someone like you lost Sarah." At the mention of Sarah's name, something inside Michael snapped. His expression hardened, and for a moment, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. He took a deep breath, fighting the flood of emotions that were rising within him. "Don't say her name," he whispered, his voice tense and filled with pain. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Emily responded firmly, not breaking eye contact. "You think closing yourself off from the world will protect you from this pain, but all you're doing is punishing yourself. Punishing yourself for something you can't control." Michael turned his face away again, his body tense, his jaw clenched. He felt the heat of anger mixed with the cold of sadness. "I lost her," he finally said, his voice trembling. and everything that came after was empty. I shut myself off because there was nothing left. And you think you can just convince me that everything's going to be okay? It's not. You did lose her, Emily said softly, her eyes filling with the tears she had been holding back. And I lost someone I loved too. But you know what I've learned, Michael? It's not the end. The pain, it doesn't go away, but you can learn to live with it. And eventually, you can find room for something more, for someone else. Her words cut deep, echoing in Michael's mind. He knew Emily was speaking the truth. He felt it, but he still couldn't accept it. He had spent so long protecting himself, so long building walls, that now letting someone in seemed impossible. I don't know if I can, he whispered, barely audible. I don't know if I can do it. Emily stood up from the chair and moved closer to the bed, sitting beside him. She took Michael's hand in hers, a simple gesture, but one that carried so much weight. He didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze her hand back either. The touch was strange, uncomfortable, but at the same time, something inside him longed for that human connection. You don't have to know now, she said softly, but you need to try. Not for me, but for yourself. Life still has something to offer you, Michael. You just have to allow it to happen. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Emily's hand in his. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something beyond pain and emptiness. But along with that moment of connection came fear. The fear that everything would fall apart again. The fear of losing someone once more. It was that fear that paralyzed him, that kept him trapped in this bed, in this life of isolation. I'm afraid, he finally admitted, his voice so low that Emily almost didn't hear him. I'm so afraid of opening up and losing everything again. Emily gently squeezed his hand, the tears she had been holding back now rolling silently down her cheeks. I know, she whispered back. I was afraid too. But sometimes, Michael, the thing we fear the most is exactly what we need to face in order to move forward. The sound of the monitors seemed to fade as they sat there in silence, sharing a moment of vulnerability that was new to both of them. The air was thick with emotion, but there was a lightness underneath, as if, for a brief moment, the weight of the world had lifted. Michael slowly opened his eyes, his thoughts still a whirlwind, but something inside him was beginning to shift. He was still afraid, still confused, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. The silence of the hospital room was broken only by the sound of the heart monitor, beeping steadily. But for Michael, the noise was no longer an annoying reminder of his fragility. He was beginning to understand that the repetitive, monotonous sound was also proof that he was still here. He still had time. He still had a chance. The past few days had been an emotional whirlwind. The conversation with Emily had left deep marks in his mind, and since then, he had been reflecting on every word spoken. The fear was still there, throbbing in his chest like an open wound, but now there was something else, a feeling that, for the first time in years, he could choose to live differently. It was a sunny morning when the doctors entered the room to discuss his discharge. Michael's recovery had been remarkable, and he was now stable enough to return home. But the Michael who would leave that hospital wasn't the same man who had entered. There was a transformation happening within him, slow, cautious, but undeniable. "Are you ready to go home, Mr. Harris?" asked the doctor with an encouraging smile. Michael nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Emily, who stood beside him as always. She had been his anchor, and he knew that now it was time to acknowledge that. It was time to admit that without her, he wouldn't have made it this far. "Emily," Michael began, his voice firmer than before, but still filled with emotion. I don't know how to thank you." She looked at him, surprised, but soon smiled, a calm and serene smile. "You don't need to thank me, Michael. I just did what anyone would do." He shook his head slowly, disagreeing. "No, it's not what anyone would do. You stayed. When everyone else left, when I pushed you away, you stayed. And I never realized how much that meant. Until now." Emily took his hand, a gesture that had become familiar between them in recent days. but now carried new weight. You weren't ready to see it before, but what matters is that you see it now. Michael felt a tightness in his chest, but this time it wasn't the same suffocating weight as before. It was a mixture of gratitude, regret, and above all, hope. He knew he still had a long way to go, but now for the first time, he was willing to walk that path. And more importantly, he was willing not to walk it alone. In the days that followed, after returning home, Michael began to rebuild his life, little by little. The house, once dark and cold, began to come to life again. He asked Emily to leave the curtains open, allowing sunlight to flood the rooms. The plants, once wilted and neglected, began to receive care. It was a subtle but clear reflection that something inside Michael was also starting to bloom. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room drinking tea, Michael looked at Emily and, for the first time, spoke about something he had never had the courage to say. "I was afraid for so long," he began, his voice soft but sincere. "Afraid of losing again, afraid of getting hurt. And that fear, it trapped me, left me paralyzed. I thought if I stayed alone, if I shut myself off from the world, nothing could hurt me." Emily listened in silence, letting him release what had tormented him for years. "But now I see that getting hurt is part of living. That pain is inevitable, but love, connections, are what make that pain worth it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, Emily. I don't know if I'm ready to fully open up, but I'm willing to try." She smiled, a smile full of understanding and support. "No one is ever completely ready, Michael. We're all learning every day. The important thing is that you're willing, and that's already a big step." In the months that followed, Michael's transformation was slow but steady. He returned to work, but with a new perspective. Instead of drowning in reports and meetings, he began to prioritize relationships, something he had neglected for so long. He reconnected with old friends, rebuilt bonds he had broken, and allowed himself to be vulnerable again, little by little. Emily, in turn, remained by his side, but now in a different role. She was no longer just the housekeeper who took care of the home. She was the friend, the confidant, the person who had believed in Michael when he hadn't believed in himself. And over time, that friendship deepened into something more, something both of them knew could develop if they were both ready. One spring morning, while walking through the park, the sun shining gently between the trees, Michael stopped and looked at Emily, his eyes filled with new life. "You saved me," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Emily shook her head, smiling. "You saved yourself, Michael. I was just by your side." Michael smiled back, but deep down he knew that without Emily, he never would have found the strength to save himself. And with that thought, he finally allowed himself to feel something he had long forgotten: peace. Michael thought that by shutting himself off from the world, he was protecting himself from pain. But what he didn't realize is that true strength lies in allowing yourself to be vulnerable, in accepting help, and in opening your heart to life again. His journey shows us that, even in the most difficult situations, there is always room for healing and new opportunities for connection. We all go through loss and hardship, but it's important to remember that isolation only deepens the wound. What truly matters is the love and support we receive and give to others. May we all strive to be like Emily, people who see beyond the pain and believe in the healing power of those around us. If you were moved by this story, leave a comment sharing your experience, subscribe to the channel, and share this message of hope with someone who needs to hear it.